On May 23, 1565, beneath a star-filled sky, a small band of knights prepared to confront a colossal Ottoman force. Their courage would change the course of history. 3 points: the unbreakable spirit. The Knights Hospitaller, driven from Jerusalem and Rhodes, found refuge in Malta. Under Grand Master Jean de la Valette, they strategized to delay, not defend, knowing their walls would eventually fall. Fort St. Elmo, with only 600 defenders, stood for 31 days against 400,000 Ottoman soldiers, buying crucial time for Malta's main defenses. A siege like no other. The Ottomans brought their best: Janissaries, Sipahi cavalry, and seasoned engineers who had conquered cities like Constantinople and Belgrade. Despite relentless bombardments, probing attacks, and a second amphibious assault, the Knights held their ground, turning defeat into a strategic delay. The miracle of relief. As the siege dragged on, disease and exhaustion sapped the Ottoman forces' strength. A small Maltese cavalry raid in August disrupted their camp, buying the defenders precious time. On September 7th, a relief fleet arrived, turning the tide and forcing the Ottomans to abandon their conquest, saving Malta from becoming another Ottoman province. Reflect on the legacy of these 6,000 men who stood firm for 143 days. Visit Valletta, walk the walls, and see for yourself where courage and defiance built an unbreakable spirit. Learn from their story and let it inspire your own acts of courage today. The night of May 23, 1565. Inside Fort St. Elmo, on the tip of the Scabarras Peninsula, Malta. The stars are extraordinary tonight. In the Mediterranean in late May, when the air is dry and the moon has not yet risen, and the only light comes from what has always come from above, the stars achieve a density that people who have lived their whole lives under clouded northern skies cannot fully anticipate. They fill the dark from horizon to horizon with a completeness that feels less like looking up and more like looking in. A man standing on the wall of Fort St. Elmo, looking north and east away from the Ottoman camp, could almost convince himself that the universe was simple and still and indifferent, and that nothing was going to happen tomorrow. He could almost convince himself. Fra Marco, not his real name, because his real name did not make it into any chronicle, but the name of every knight who stood on a wall the night before a battle, stands on the rampart of St. Elmo and completes the rosary he has been saying since the office of Compline, and when the last bead passes through his fingers, he does not put the rosary away, but holds it in his fist and looks south instead, toward the Ottoman camp. The Ottoman camp does not look like darkness. It looks like a second city, a city of fire. The campfires of 40,000 men spread across the plain south of Marsamuchetto harbor, in a constellation that mocks the one above it with its scale. 40,000. The number had been said so many times in the past week that it had stopped being a number and had become a condition of existence, like the heat or the stone or the weight of the armor, something you carried rather than calculated. There are perhaps 600 men in Fort St. Elmo. Behind him, across the harbor, in Birgu and Senglea together, there are perhaps 5,000 more, 6,000 in total, against 40,000, on an island in the middle of the Mediterranean from which there is nowhere to retreat and to which relief may or may not come in time. Fra Marco looks at the fires. He is not afraid. Or rather, he is afraid in the way that training has taught him to be afraid, a background condition that sharpens attention without paralyzing action, that sits behind everything he does without occupying the foreground. He was afraid last year and the year before that, and every year he has been a knight, and the fear has never stopped him from doing what needed doing, so he has learned to regard it as irrelevant to the question of what he will do tomorrow. Tomorrow, the Ottoman artillery will open. He knows this because it is what he would do if he had 300 guns and 40,000 soldiers and a fortress to reduce. He has been studying the Ottoman batteries for 2 days, watching them position the guns, watching the angles, estimating the calibers. The walls of St. Elmo are good walls, But no wall survives unlimited artillery for an unlimited time. And the question is not whether they will fall, but how long they will take to fall, and whether 600 men can make that long enough for what needs to happen to happen. He puts the rosary in his pocket and picks up his sword and goes back to his post. In the morning, the guns open. This siege, 4 months on a rock island in the sea, changed the Mediterranean forever. It was the moment that the Ottoman Empire, which had been expanding westward since the fall of Constantinople in 1453, hit the wall that would not move. Not a wall of stone, a wall of men. 6,000 of them, most of them ordinary soldiers and Maltese farmers and mercenaries from a dozen countries, led by a 70-year-old Grand Master who had decided before the fleet appeared on the horizon that he was not leaving this island alive, and that neither were the Ottomans. The Knights Hospitaller were, by 1565, an institution that had no right to still exist. They had been founded in Jerusalem in the aftermath of the First Crusade as a charitable organization. Monks who cared for sick pilgrims traveling to the Holy City, who provided hospitals and food and the basic human infrastructure that a religious journey of that era required. Over the following 2 centuries, they had evolved into something different. A military order, a fighting force whose purpose was to defend the Christian presence in the Holy Land, and whose members were warrior monks, men who had taken the religious vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and added to them a 4th and unofficial vow that might be summarized as violence in the service of faith. They had been driven from the Holy Land when it fell. They had established themselves on Rhodes, a large Greek island in the eastern Mediterranean, and from Rhodes they had spent 200 years as the western Mediterranean's most determined pirates, raiding Ottoman shipping and Ottoman shores and Ottoman-aligned vessels with a consistency that made them, in the Sultan's court, a running wound rather than a serious strategic threat. Not large enough to fight directly, too persistent to ignore. Suleiman the Magnificent had solved the Rhodes problem in 1522 by sending an army of 100,000 men to reduce the island. The siege had lasted 5 months. When the knights finally yielded, Suleiman had allowed them to depart with their lives, their weapons, and their honor, an act of magnanimity that he would regret for the next 43 years. They had gone to Malta, received the island from Emperor Charles V as a perpetual fiefdom in exchange for the annual presentation of a single falcon, and had spent the subsequent decades rebuilding their capacity to be a nuisance on an industrial scale. The new nuisance was Romega. Mathurin d'Odelescu, called Romegas, was the most successful naval commander in the order's service, a man who seemed constitutionally incapable of letting an Ottoman vessel pass without boarding it. In 1564, he had outdone even himself, capturing ships that carried among their passengers the governor of Cairo and the governor of Alexandria, and several attendants of Kustir Aga, an influential official at the Sultan's court. Kustir Aga had access to Suleiman's ear. He used it. The Sultan, who had been contemplating a direct assault on Malta for years, made his decision. He assembled a fleet of 190 ships and an army of 40,000 men. And here, before another word is said, the weight of that number must be given its full measure, because the 40,000 who arrived at Malta on May 18, 1565, were not 40,000 conscripts with spears. They were the military instrument of the most powerful empire in the eastern Mediterranean, at the zenith of that empire's military effectiveness, and they required a description proportionate to what they actually were. The Janissaries were the cutting edge. They were not ordinary soldiers. They were the product of a system called the Devshirme, the periodic collection of Christian boys from the Ottoman Balkans, taken at ages 8 to 12, converted to Islam, educated in the Topkapi schools, trained from childhood in the single discipline of military service. By the time a Janissary arrived at Malta, he had been in military training for 15 to 20 years. He could fire a musket accurately. He could use a crossbow. He could fight at close quarters with a sword or axe with the automatic competence of a man who has done nothing else since childhood. He had no family waiting for him at home, no farm to return to, no alternative identity to fall back on. He was, entirely and without remainder, a soldier. But the Janissary was not merely a product of training. He was a product of identity, an institutional identity so total that the Corps' welfare was his welfare, the Corps' honor was his honor, and the Corps' humiliation was a wound felt personally by every man in it. When Janissaries failed at a siege, they did not simply note the failure and plan another approach. They took it as a challenge to something fundamental about what they were, and they came back with a ferocity that military historians consistently describe as qualitatively different from the second assault of an ordinary army. The Janissaries were perhaps 12 to 15,000 of the 40,000. Behind them came Sipahi cavalry, the Turkish horsemen whose lineage as mounted warriors stretched back to the steppe, men who had grown up on horseback and fought on horseback, and whose tactical function was the pursuit and envelopment that turned a tactical victory into a strategic annihilation. But cavalry had limited utility in a siege. The Sipahis who were at Malta were there partly as a reserve and partly as a demonstration of the Sultan's total commitment. He had not sent what was needed. He had sent everything. And behind the cavalry came the artillery crews and the engineers, who were in some ways the most frightening element of all, because their work was not dramatic and not visible from the walls, but was patient and systematic and inexorable. The Ottoman siege engineers of 1565 had reduced Constantinople, Belgrade, Rhodes, and a dozen other cities whose walls were supposed to be adequate. They knew how to concentrate fire on structural weaknesses. They knew how to dig approach trenches that allowed infantry to begin an assault from positions the defenders could barely reach. They knew how to mine under walls and fill the tunnels with powder and weight. They had been doing this for a century, and their knowledge was institutional rather than individual. It lived in the corps of engineers rather than in any single man, which meant it could not be killed by killing one person, and could not be depleted by ordinary attrition. They were, in other words, the kind of enemy that does not run out of methods. They just come at you differently until they find the way through. Dragut, Turgut Reis, called by his enemies the drawn sword of Islam, called by his allies the most dangerous man on the water. He had been raiding Christian shipping since the 1520s, had been captured and enslaved and ransomed, and had returned to raiding with an intensity that captivity apparently intensified rather than diminished. He had taken Tripoli from the knights themselves in 1551, in a brief siege that demonstrated what he could do with limited resources, and had spent the following decade extending Ottoman maritime power so far west that the coasts of Spain were not safe from his ships. He was not officially in command of the Malta expedition. Lala Mustafa Pasha commanded the land forces, Piale Pasha commanded the fleet, and the Sultan had sent for Dragut to join when he arrived and serve as a kind of strategic arbiter above the other two commanders, whose rivalry was already known to be a problem. But Dragut had not arrived yet when the fleet reached Malta and the first council of war was held, and his absence shaped the first decision in a direction that he would later say was wrong. Against this force, this concentrated product of the most effective military tradition in the Mediterranean, stood the Knights of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, also known as the Knights of Malta, also known by their older name, the Knights Hospitaller, who had been driven from Jerusalem and driven from Rhodes and had nowhere left to be driven to. Jean Périsseau de la Valette commanded them. He was 70 years old. He had been a knight since he was 20. He had been captured in a sea battle once and had spent a year rowing in Ottoman galley chains, which had given him an education in what the Ottoman military machine felt like from inside its grip. And he had carried that education with him for 40 years. And when the Sultan's fleet appeared on the horizon in May 1565, he was as prepared as 40 years of preparation could make him. The quality that defined La Valette was not strategic brilliance or tactical innovation, though he was capable of both. It was something older and simpler. He had decided, at some point in the months before the siege, that he would not survive it. That decision had freed him from the calculations that compromise most defensive operations, the calculations of acceptable loss and strategic withdrawal, and the preservation of forces for future engagements. He was not preserving anything. He was spending it. Everything. Every man and every stone and every barrel of water and every grain of gunpowder on this island was material to be used until it was gone. And then, if it was God's will, the relief would have come. And if it was not God's will, then it was not God's will, and he had done what he could. He had summoned every knight he could reach. He had poisoned the wells. He had harvested the grain. He had loaded the magazines. He had positioned his guns. He had done, in short, everything that a man who intends to hold a position intends to do. And then he waited for morning. The specific logic of his defensive strategy deserves a moment's examination, because it was not the logic of a commander who believed his position was defensible in any conventional sense. He knew it was not. He knew the walls would eventually fail under the bombardment that was coming. He knew the garrison was too small to defend every point simultaneously. He knew the relief was not certain and not fast. What he had designed was not a defense. It was a delay whose duration he hoped would be sufficient and whose cost he had already accepted would be total. The delay began at Fort St. Elmo, which he had garrisoned, knowing it would fall and calculating that it would fall expensively. The delay continued in Burgu and Sanglea, which he had positioned to be as hard to take as possible while being positioned to be the last position standing after the outer defenses went. The delay ended, if it worked, when the relief arrived. If the relief did not arrive, the delay ended differently.
La Valette had not told his men this in quite those terms, but he had told them enough that the men who understood could understand, and the men who could not understand the full strategic picture could at least understand the immediate instruction. Hold this position today, and hold it again tomorrow. The shape of the defense. Malta's harbors are what make Malta worth fighting over. The Grand Harbor on the eastern side of the island is one of the finest natural harbors in the Mediterranean, deep, protected, large enough to shelter a fleet of significant size, surrounded by land that provides natural elevation for defensive positions. It is connected to the sea by a relatively narrow entrance, which means that any fleet using it can be protected by guns on either side of the entrance channel. For a naval power, and the Knights were fundamentally a naval power, their military tradition built around the galley and the sea, a harbor like the Grand Harbor was both home and fortress. The two peninsulas that extended into the harbor from the west, Birgu on the south, Sanglea on the north, were the heart of the Knights' position. Each peninsula jutted into the harbor like a finger, accessible from the land only at its base, where a moat and a wall blocked the approach. The water surrounded them on three sides. Fort St. Angelo, the Knights' headquarters, sat at the tip of Birgu, its walls rising directly from the harbor water. Fort St. Michael anchored the tip of Sanglea. Between the two peninsulas, the galley port was sealed by a massive iron chain that no vessel could pass while the chain held. North of the Grand Harbor entrance, on the Sybaris Peninsula, stood Fort St. Elmo. It was newer than St. Angelo, built in less than a year, its walls not as thick as established military engineering would recommend, its garrison capacity limited. But it commanded the entrance to the Grand Harbor and to the adjacent harbor of Marsamusetto, and any Ottoman fleet that intended to use either harbor as a sheltered anchorage would need to eliminate St. Elmo's guns first. The strategic problem that La Valette faced was this. Fort St. Elmo could not be defended indefinitely. Its walls were not strong enough, its garrison too small, its position too exposed to be held against the weight that the Ottoman army would bring to bear. But every day that St. Elmo held was a day that the defenders of Birgu and Sanglea could prepare, a day that the relief army in Sicily could not quite yet have organized, a day that the Ottoman army spent in casualties and supplies and the particular psychological erosion of a siege that takes longer than expected. St. Elmo was the sacrifice. La Valette knew it. The men he put in St. Elmo knew it. They went in anyway.
Lavalette's force numbered across all positions between 6,000 and 9,000 men, depending on how civilian fighters and sailors were counted. The core of the fighting force was approximately 500 to 600 Knights of the Order, supported by 1,200 professional soldiers from Italy, Spain, and Greece. Additional fighters from across the European Catholic world had come in response to the Grand Master's summons. Volunteers and mercenaries, and men who understood that the alternative to fighting here was fighting somewhere else, and that fighting here was at least fighting in a prepared position with supplies. The Maltese population itself, which had historically regarded the Knights with the ambivalence that occupied people feel toward their occupiers, provided additional fighters. Pragmatism is a powerful motivator. The Maltese understood that if the Knights fell, their position under direct Ottoman rule would be considerably less comfortable than their position under the Knights. They manned the walls.
Lavalette had established his defensive strategy in the weeks before the Ottoman fleet arrived, and had not deviated from it when the fleet appeared. The outer harbors would be contested by Fort St. Elmo's guns as long as St. Elmo stood. The main position in Birgu and Sanglia would be held until it could not be held. If Birgu fell, the remaining defenders would concentrate in Fort St. Angelo and hold there until the relief came or until everyone was dead. The bridge over the moat of Fort St. Angelo was intact, but Lavalette had a plan for it that he had not yet executed. On the Ottoman side, the Council of War held on May 21st, before Dragut had arrived, produced the decision that shaped the entire siege. Lala Mustafa Pasha wanted to begin with Mdina, the old inland capital, take it as a base for land operations, and then reduce the harbor positions systematically. Piali Pasha wanted Fort St. Elmo taken immediately, because St. Elmo's guns threatened the fleet, and a threatened fleet was a fleet that could not perform its logistical function for an army of 40,000 men who needed to be fed from ships. The argument went back and forth with the specificity of two commanders who disagreed on strategy and were too equal in rank and confidence to reach a clean resolution. Mustafa eventually yielded. St. Elmo first. Dragut, when he arrived, assessed the decision and said it was wrong, but it was too late to change it. The night before the opening bombardment, Jean de Lavalette walked the walls of Birgu. He walked them alone, in the manner of a commander who needs to see and hear for himself what the morning will bring. The walls were still intact. The guns were in their positions. The magazines were loaded. The supplies were where they should be. He had done everything he could, and everything that could be done with what he had, and the question of whether it would be enough was a question that the coming weeks would answer.
He stopped at the section of wall that faced the Corradino Heights to the south, where the Ottoman batteries were being positioned, and he looked at the work they were doing by lamplight across the harbor, the silhouettes of men moving guns into position, the sounds of chains and wheels and commands in Turkish carrying across the water in the quiet of the night. And he assessed what he saw with the careful attention of a man who has been doing exactly this for 50 years. Then he went back inside and prayed matins. Tomorrow it would begin. A knight named Fra Rodrigo, young from a Spanish noble family, his first real campaign, lay on the stone floor of the small chapel of Fort St. Elmo that night and could not sleep. The stone was hard against his back, and the night air was warm, and the sounds from outside the fort, the Ottoman camp, always active, always producing its ambient rumble of 40,000 people organized for war, would not let his mind settle into the blankness that sleep required. He had been trained for this, but training and the actual thing had a distance between them that he had not fully appreciated until now, lying on a stone floor in a fort that was going to be bombarded in the morning, aware that the men who would bombard it wanted everyone inside it dead. He said the office of matins in the dark, then the office of lauds, though it was early for it. Then he waited for the light, and when the light came, the guns came with it. What 300 guns sound like.
The Ottoman artillery opened on Fort St. Elmo at dawn on May 24th, 1565, and the sound of it reached every man on Malta simultaneously. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. The combined report of 300 guns firing at approximately the same moment is a physical event, a pressure wave that travels faster than any human nervous system can individually process, and that arrives as a single impact, a blow to the chest, the ears, the lungs, before the brain resolves it into the separate sounds of separate guns. Every defender in every position on Malta, from the men in St. Elmo's walls to the knights on Fort St. Angelo's ramparts to La Valette in his quarters in Birgu, felt the opening barrage before they heard it clearly. Then the sound resolved. The individual guns became distinguishable as the initial shock passed, and the continuous thunder of the sustained barrage settled into the rhythm of sequential fire, each gun loaded and fired at the rate that its crew could manage, somewhere between 12 and 20 shots per day for the largest pieces, faster for the smaller guns. And the rhythm became, over the hours that followed, a background condition that the defenders learned to inhabit the way they inhabited the heat or the dust, as a fact of existence rather than an event. But every impact was an event. Each ball that struck the walls of St. Elmo was felt inside the fort as a concussion, a trembling of the stone beneath boots and hands and the bodies of the men who pressed against the walls for cover. The smaller balls chipped and cracked the limestone. The larger balls, the 100-pound stone projectiles of the heaviest Turkish bombards, the guns that had reduced the walls of Constantinople in 1453, struck the walls like hammer blows from a hammer the size of a small room, each impact removing not a chip but a section, leaving a wound in the stone that the next ball would widen. Fra Rodrigo was at his position on the southern rampart when the first ball struck the wall 20 feet from where he stood. The impact threw fragments of limestone inward, small, sharp, moving fast, and 2 men near him were hit, one badly enough to leave his position. Fra Rodrigo was not hit. He pressed himself against the rampart face and waited until the immediate shower of fragments was over, and then he came up to his firing position, because that was the only sensible thing to do,
because staying pressed against the wall was something to do during the impact, but not between impacts. And between impacts, there were Ottoman troops advancing in the outer approaches, who needed to be discouraged. By mid-morning, the first Ottoman probing attacks had begun. Not the full assault, not yet, but the forward elements testing the walls, looking for soft points, trying to understand the garrison's strength and the wall's remaining integrity. Fra Rodrigo shot at them with his musket from the rampart, reloading and firing at the rhythm that training had made automatic. And the men beside him did the same, and the probing attacks were turned back. But the wall behind them was shorter than it had been at dawn. By midday, the wall had lost perhaps 3 feet of height from the accumulated impacts. 3 feet is enough to change the defensive equation on a rampart. The men who had been shooting from behind a parapet that reached their shoulders were now shooting from behind one that reached their chests. By evening, they would be shooting from behind one that reached their waists. The wall was not broken, but it was being consumed. The evening of the first day saw the bombardment ease as the Ottoman crews rested. St. Elmo still stood. The garrison assessed its condition, wounded numbering in the dozens, wall damage significant but not yet critical, ammunition sufficient for several days of sustained defense. Fra Rodrigo had fired his musket 40 times. He had seen 5 men from his company hit, 2 of them mortally. He cleaned his musket in the dark and tried to sleep, and could not, because the numbers in his head would not stop being the numbers they were. The siege of Fort St. Elmo lasted 31 days. 31 days is a long time to be in a fort that is being systematically destroyed. The Ottoman artillery did not stop except at night, and sometimes not fully at night. The assaults came regularly. June 3rd, when the Ottoman infantry took the ravelin and established the elevated firing position that changed everything. June 8th, when a second assault pushed the garrison to the wall itself and was repulsed in fighting close enough that the smell of enemy breath was part of the experience. June 15th and 16th, when 2 consecutive days of assault left the garrison so depleted that the surviving knights took counsel together and sent a message to La Valette. The message was honest in the way that men who have accepted their situation can afford to be honest. It said, "The fort cannot be held. The walls are damaged past repair. The garrison is less than a third of what it was. We cannot survive another assault. Give us leave to withdraw across the harbor." La Valette read the message and thought about it for perhaps the time it takes to read a message twice. His reply was not gentle. It said, "You cannot withdraw. Every day you hold means another day for the relief. Every man who dies in St. Elmo dies for the men in Birgu and Senglia who might otherwise die first. If you believe the position is indefensible, I will send fresh men, and you may come across to Birgu. But come across in shame, abandoning your post before God and your brothers." The garrison replied that they would stay. Some of them came across anyway. The most badly wounded exchanged for fresh soldiers who rowed across the harbor at night, who understood what they were rowing toward and did it because La Valette had asked them to, and because the men in the fort were their brothers, and because the code of the order was not a piece of paper, but a thing you carried in your body. But then Dragut came to the forward trench. He had been directing the bombardment personally for days, walking the positions, correcting the gun crews, adjusting angles with the expertise of a man who had been reducing fortifications for 4 decades. He was not content to direct from distance. He was in the trench, 20 yards from the walls of St. Elmo, personally ensuring that the guns were aimed where they needed to be aimed. A stone fragment, thrown by an Ottoman gun that fired too low and struck the earth rather than the wall, rose in a fragment shower that reached the trench. The fragment that reached Dragut struck him in the head. He did not die immediately. He was carried to his tent, where he lay unconscious for 5 days. When he died on June 23rd, the same day Fort St. Elmo finally fell, some in the Ottoman camp said that the God of the Christians had taken their finest warrior in exchange for the fortress he was giving up. Lala Mustafa, standing at the smoking ruin of the fort, surveying the remains of the garrison that had cost him 6,000 men and 31 days, is reported to have said, "If so small a son costs us so dear, what price shall we have to pay for the Father?" The answer was waiting across the harbor. Fort St. Elmo had fallen, but it had fallen in ruins, surrounded by 8 times its garrison's number in Ottoman dead, and La Valette had had 31 days. The sea within the harbor. The fall of Fort St. Elmo transformed the siege. Mustafa now controlled Marsamachetto Harbor. The fleet was sheltered, the logistical situation improved, the outer position of the defense gone. He had 4 batteries positioned on the heights overlooking Birgu and Senglia, and he opened them against the main position with the full weight of what he had. The walls of Birgu began to receive the same treatment that St. Elmo's walls had received, and the result began to be the same result. Damage accumulating faster than repair could address it, sections of wall that had been solid limestone becoming gradually limestone held together by timber shoring and packed earth and the determination of the men who maintained them. But Mustafa was not content with bombardment. He had a fleet, and the fleet could be used in ways that land-only sieges could not accommodate. He ordered 100 boats of various sizes to be hauled overland from Marsalak Bay to the Marsa, a journey of several kilometers across the Corradino Heights, requiring teams of men and animal labor over several days, conducted in as much secrecy as moving 100 boats overland across an island can be conducted. The Maltese population behind the walls watched and reported. La Valette learned what was being prepared. He drove stakes into the shallow water along the western shore of Senglia, connecting them with chains. He built a pontoon bridge of barrels and planks across the southern end of the galley port,
connecting Sanglia and Birgu so that men and supplies could cross quickly when the assault came. He positioned a battery below the usual sight line near the chain, invisible to Ottoman scouts, with orders to remain silent until the sea assault began. July 15th, 1565. The drums of the Ottoman assault sounded before dawn. They came from the north, from the south, from the sea, from everywhere simultaneously. The full application of everything Mustafa had, directed at every point of the defense at once, aimed at finding the weakness that would exist somewhere in a 6,000-man garrison defending a mile of walls against a sustained assault from 40,000. The Ottoman boats came from the Marsa, rowing south through the inner harbor toward the Sanglia shore, their oarsmen driving the hulls through water that was still dark in the pre-dawn light, their assault troops standing in the bows with weapons ready, believing that the surprise of the sea attack would carry them to the walls before the defenders could respond. But the stakes were there. The first boats to reach the Sanglia shore hit the stake row at speed. The boats capsized or stopped dead, throwing men into water 3 feet deep, deep enough to drown in armor,
Shallow enough that men without armor could wade. But the armor was not something that came off quickly, and the wading was slow, and the defenders above them were not slow. The boats that tried to maneuver around the stake row were caught in the crossfire from the defensive positions on both sides of the landing area. But some boats found a gap. 10 large boats, carrying perhaps 1,000 janissaries in total, drove through an opening in the stake row at a section of shore that Lavalette's engineers had not fully protected. The janissaries poured ashore and moved toward the walls with the specific urgency of men who know that every second they are on an exposed beach, they are dying. Lavalette's hidden battery opened. At close range, loaded with whatever ammunition the battery held, shot, chain shot, grape shot, anything that would spread at close range, the battery fired into the boats still approaching and into the janissaries who had not yet made shore. 8 of the 10 large boats were destroyed or sunk in the space of minutes. The janissaries already ashore were isolated, their support cut off, fighting against walls with nothing coming behind them. The pontoon bridge worked exactly as planned. 5 units from Birgu crossed the bridge to reinforce Sanglia's wall garrison, which had been thinning under the assault pressure, and the reinforced line met the isolated janissaries on the shore and stopped them. The sea assault died on the beach, and the land assault pressed St. Michael's walls through the day, and by evening the assault had been repulsed on every front. By Mustafa's own accounting, 4,000 men were lost on July 15th. But the walls were weaker. The miracle that came from Mdina. August in Malta is the month when the heat becomes a siege weapon in its own right. The temperature on the Corradino Heights, where the Ottoman batteries had been emplaced since June, reached levels that made the gun crew's work genuinely dangerous. Not from enemy fire, but from dehydration and heat exhaustion. From the particular physiology of men working hard physical labor in direct summer sun on the limestone island with limited shade and water sources that had been contaminated or used up. The Ottoman army was not dying of heat, but it was suffering from it in ways that compounded the other sufferings of a siege that had lasted twice as long as anyone in the Ottoman command had expected. Disease had entered the camp. The specific disease is not named in the sources, but the description of its effects, the rapid progression from fever to death, the way it moved through the crowded camp conditions that 40,000 men sharing a small area inevitably created, sounds consistent with plague or typhus, either of which would have been plausible given the conditions. Hundreds of men were sick. The sick became dead with a regularity that worried the medical officials who were supposed to be managing the army's health. The defenders were not suffering from these specific conditions. They were dying from wounds and from hunger and from the accumulated physical destruction of 4 months of siege. But they were not sick in the plague sense, partly because their population was too small and too isolated to sustain the kind of transmission that the Ottoman camp was experiencing. But the defenders were almost gone. By early August,
A Spanish soldier had deserted to the Ottoman side. Mustafa received him with the specific attention that intelligence about the enemy's condition always receives, and the soldier told him what he had seen. The garrison was perhaps 1,000 men capable of fighting, maybe fewer. The walls were rubble, held together with timber and prayer. The ammunition was running low. The Grand Master was personally fighting at the walls because there was no one else. Mustafa planned the final assault for August 7th, and it failed, somehow, in ways that the sources cannot fully explain. The accounts of the garrison at the breach of St. Michael give conflicting information about what specific factors saved the position on that day. What is clear is that Lavalette was at the breach with a weapon in his hand, at 70 years old, and that the line held. He prepared for August 18th and 19th and 20th, the final 3-day assault that would be the last effort before the autumn storms made the campaign impossible. But then, on the afternoon of August 7th, while the remnants of the failed assault were pulling back from the walls, the sound of the battle suddenly changed. The Ottoman assault force, deep in the engagement against the walls of Birgu, began to receive news from the direction of the Ottoman camp at Marsa. The camp was under attack. Horses were loose. Fires were burning. Christian soldiers were in the camp. The attack was not what the Ottoman assault force assumed it was. It was a cavalry troop from Medina, the old inland capital, still in Maltese hands, its small garrison having made no offensive moves through the entire siege until this one moment of opportunity when the camp was essentially empty of anyone capable of stopping them. 100 horsemen and some infantry, who had watched the Ottoman force march south to the assault and had realized that there was nothing between them and the camp. They had ridden out and done what cavalry does to an undefended camp: freed the horses, set fires, killed whoever was there to be killed. But the Ottoman assault force didn't know it was 100 men. What they heard, through the rumor mill of an army that was already fatigued and afraid, and fighting a siege that should have been over weeks ago, was that the Grande Soccorso had arrived, the great Spanish relief force, the thousands of soldiers that everyone on both sides had been waiting for. The relief was here. They were going to be cut off between the walls and the relief army. They retreated. When Mustafa realized what had happened, when the scouts came back and reported that the attackers were a small Maltese cavalry unit and not a Spanish army, he was, according to the chronicles, in a state of cold rage that he expressed primarily by swearing that no quarter would be given. But the assault had been broken. The days that followed gave the garrison time they should not have had. The great assault of August 18th to 20th came as promised. The bombardment in the 2 days before it was heavier than anything that had preceded it, as if Mustafa intended to put into the final effort the full weight of every shell and ball that remained in the magazines. What it did to the walls of Birgu and Senglia was visible from the Ottoman positions. The limestone that had been crumbling and patching and crumbling again for 3 months was reduced in the final bombardment to something that no longer looked like architecture. The bastion of Castile, on the western flank of Birgu, was a heap of rubble with defenders standing in it. The assault waves came on the 18th and 19th, testing, probing, tiring, and the main blow fell on the 20th. Lavalette was at the bastion of Castile. He was 70 years old, and he had been fighting, in one form or another, since the siege began 4 months ago, and the available accounts describe him at this moment in the specific terms that witnesses use when they are describing something they are still processing: present, armed, fighting in the rubble alongside the men who had nothing left to give except what they were still giving. The bastion fell. Not completely. The line bent and cracked, and the Ottoman infantry was in the breach, and it was a question of whether the line would hold or whether this was finally the end. Then the Ottoman advance slowed. Then it stopped. Then it retreated. 10 days later, Lavalette learned why. An escaped prisoner brought news from the Ottoman camp. They had run out of powder. The food situation was desperate. The sick were numerous. Mustafa had calculated that he could not take the position before the autumn storms made the fleet's return impossible, and he had made a decision.
On September 7th, the defenders saw sails on the northern horizon. Don Garcia de Toledo, the Count of the Living. September 14th, 1565. Jean de La Valette stood in the harbor of Birgu and received the leaders of the relief army. He had won. The word is too small for what had happened, but there is no larger word available, and the facts that the word must carry are these. Fort St. Elmo had fallen, taking its garrison with it. The walls of Birgu and Sanglia had been reduced to rubble in most sections. The ammunition was nearly gone. The food was nearly gone. And the Ottoman fleet had sailed away. The relief force that Don Garcia de Toledo had sent was 8,000 soldiers under an Italian condottiero named Ascanio della Cornia, and the story of the final engagement, the Ottoman cancellation of retreat when Mustafa learned the relief was smaller than feared, the battle on the ridge east of Medina where della Cornia's fresh troops routed the exhausted Ottoman survivors, the final embarkation at St. Paul's Bay, had played out in the 10 days between the relief's arrival and its final resolution. But the siege was over when the sails appeared. Everything after was resolution. The harbor was quiet in a way it had not been since May. La Valette's men moved through it in the manner of people who are accustomed to a noise that is suddenly stopped, who keep expecting it to resume and find each silence more improbable than the last. The walls were rubble. The buildings inside the walls had been damaged by fall-through artillery fire. The streets of Birgu carried the accumulated evidence of 4 months of siege, the marks of fire, the cracked paving, the patches of earth that covered the dead where they had been buried in the positions where they fell, because there was no time to carry them further. The relief troops brought food. The moment that the food arrived, bread, meat, wine, the basic calories that the garrison had been calculating since July, was the moment that the reality of survival became something beyond a military condition. La Valette thanked God. He said the Mass of Thanksgiving in the Church of St. Lawrence in Birgu, surrounded by the men who had survived, and the Mass was celebrated in the half-ruined church with the specific intensity of a liturgy performed by people who were not entirely certain they would live to perform it. The casualties on both sides were enormous by any measure. Of the 6,000 to 9,000 defenders who had begun the siege, fewer than 1,000 remained capable of active service at its end. The dead included the entire garrison of Fort St. Elmo, 600 men who had held the fort for 31 days and died in it. They included the soldiers who had died at the walls of Birgu and Sanglia in the general assaults of July and August. They included the civilians who had been in the wrong place when artillery fell through roofs. The Ottoman dead numbered, by the various estimates that survive, approximately 25,000, with another 10,000 wounded. From 40,000 soldiers sent by Suleiman the Magnificent, perhaps 15,000 returned to Constantinople, capable of military service. The rest were in Malta's soil, or in the Mediterranean, or in the field hospitals that would become graves over the following weeks. Mustafa reached Constantinople with his surviving force and his report. The report was delivered to Suleiman's court in the autumn of 1565, and the Sultan who received it was not the Sultan who had assembled the expedition in the spring. The Malta campaign had not physically harmed Suleiman, but it had done something that no previous campaign of his reign had done. It had returned empty. He had sent 40,000 men to conquer an island defended by 6,000, and 6,000 had not allowed it. The political consequences of this fact were absorbed carefully and slowly in the Ottoman court. The tradition was to not rush the analysis of a disaster, to let the initial shock pass before making the decisions that might be made poorly